to be your host today. My name is Patrizia Cocca, and I am the lead for knowledge management and communication at the Global Evaluation Initiative. We are very happy today to be hosting this first webinar of 2024 that we have co-organized with our CLEAR centers from Francophone Africa. And today we're going to discuss this very interesting topic about how we can close the gap between decision-making and evidence, and how we can make this marriage happier, or if it's possible. And but also we will hear from our panelists about their experience. We will have, this is our agenda of the day, so we will go through some presentations and we will hear the panelists about their experience, but also there will be a session where we will try to answer your questions. And then there will be a summary and conclusion. Today, your moderator will be Dr. Edoé Agbodjan. He is the director of the CLEAR Center in Francophone Africa. And without further ado, Edoé, I'll pass the microphone to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrizia. Hello, everyone. It is truly a privilege to welcome you here to this webinar today. As it was announced earlier, this webinar is going to look at questions of rationality, irrationality, and reality, the uneasy marriage between decision-making and evidence. So we think that it is quite important to talk about this subject with regards to using evidence for decision-making, because we, with CEI and with CLEAR, are committed to building capacity for evaluation, or building capacity and encouraging institutionalization of evaluation. Using evidence can improve the quality of policies, and which will in turn improve the lives of people across the world. This is what we believe, and this is what we preach. CLEAR has been working for about 10 years, and we are looking at the improvement in Francophone African countries. There are many countries in Francophone Africa that are working to encourage more governmental institutions of M&E, and also to have a national evaluation policy that will promote evaluation. So about 4 of them have done that, 20%. And we have 11 that have performed a diagnostic study of national capacity. We're seeing a growing will among these countries to work to achieve these goals. And we know that it's the uptake of the idea that evidence can contribute to better decision-making. We want to make sure that decisions are made rationally. When you have evidence, of course, you can then rationally make the appropriate decision to improve policies. This is an example from Senegal, and a quote from the speech for the inauguration of the rapid bus transit system in Dakar in Senegal. The president said that a study was performed in 1998 and updated in 2022. The study showed that Senegal, on average, lost 900 billion CFA francs each year because of automobile pollution, congestion, and inadequate road safety. And this led them to develop a solution that was a system of transportation that allowed them to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. So this is an example of the application and the use of evidence for better decision making. Unfortunately, this is not a generalized situation. Often we hear that data exists, but decision making doesn't necessarily follow the evidence. So in terms of decisions, often it's important to say, sleep on it. We have all of these symbols of the night. Nighttime is a time of mystery. It's when we are not necessarily conscious, so we turn to instinct and to illusions. Night can also represent ignorance. So this attitude of behaviors that are not based on evidence, that are not based on data, leads us into the dangers of what is associated with nighttime. So what happens in the process from data generation to decision making? What is the process that will promote this kind of evidence-based decision making? This is what we're going to talk about today. And we are going to base our discussion today on the reality on the ground in the different countries. And we're going to look at what has happened from the first steps of using the data at an international level, and then we're going to look at how we can make better decisions using evidence. So for this discussion, we are very lucky to have with us several distinguished panelists, and we are very grateful for their time today. First, we have Ian Goldman, who is the president of the International Evaluation Academy. He has a wealth of experience. He has implemented many different national evaluation systems, particularly in South Africa. He has worked with CLEAR in Anglophone Africa, BCEAO and CIS. He is an adjunct professor at Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. Next slide. In addition to Jan, we also are welcoming Mohamed Dia, who works in quantitative methods and operations management. He is a professor, and he works on decision sciences and analytics. And so he will be presenting an expert academic opinion today. In addition to Professor Dia, we also have with us today Mr. Antonin Sourou, who was the Minister for Public Policy Evaluation in Benin. He has been the Director of Financial Stability in the central bank of West African states. He has also looked at using evidence and data for decision making in Francophone Africa. And last but not least, next slide, we are going to hear from Gonzalo Hernández Licona, who is the director of a network, the Multidimensional Poverty Network. He is also an advisor for GEI and a member of the Evaluation Advisory Group at IFAD, and he is a professor at ITAM. So these are the speakers that we will be hearing from today. So without further ado, next slide, I'm going to hand the floor over to our first speaker, Professor Ian, who is going to present his reflections on a conceptual framework and using evidence in policy and practice. Ian, over to you.
So, hello everybody. Good to be with you. And I'm going to talk particularly about the research which led to the book on this slide, which we conducted in 2018-2019, where we looked at 8 cases from 6 countries, taking a policymaker rather than a researcher perspective on evidence use. And we explored how different types of evidence from evaluations, from research, from rapid synthesis, from citizen engagement, what fostered that evidence to be used. And these are the links to the open access book, which is available in English and in French. And there are 2 cases from South Africa, there are 2 cases from Uganda, there's one from Benin, there's one from Kenya, there's one from Ghana, and there's one working with ECOWAS around tobacco control in West Africa. And just to start, I mean, this is research that we did with the Twende Mbele program, and it was looking at how policymakers, decision makers, managers in the public service use evidence. And you can say that the percentages there, or the percentage of respondents saying that people often or always that this happens. So, for example, resistance by management to transparent decision-making, 36% or 33% of managers in Benin or Uganda said this was always often happening, a little bit less in South Africa. Little respect for the use of evidence, around 1/3 of managers were saying this was happening. It's difficult to discuss the performance objectively because of the hierarchy. Somewhere around 40% of managers said this was the case. And when we talk about admitting mistakes or problems, around 50% of managers were saying this was the case. Many managers see monitoring and evaluation as a means to control staff, and problems are generally, in half the managers saw it as not being taken as an opportunity for learning and improvement. And this is a big challenge if we want to bring in evaluation, for example, as a way of informing decision-making. If people do not see the need to use evidence in these sort of ways to improve performance. And I'm going to introduce to you this analytical framework or theory of change around evidence use, which we developed for the book. I'm just going to take it, one stage at a time. So obviously, the context is very important. And we're using this in a behavior change context. How do we change people's behavior so that they use evidence? So the external dimension, how the public service works, how civil society interacts with the public service, the type of macro issues which are affecting the state. And then there are internal dimensions, for example, the culture of particular organizations, departments or ministries, the organizational capacity, the way leadership and management operates. And we're operating for the point that there is some demand for evidence. As I said, this is a policymaker. We took a policymaker focus, not a researcher focus. So this is where governments are looking for some evidence to support their programs. And obviously, then there can be different types of evidence. There are issues about the quality or rigor of the evidence. There are other issues about generation, like, for example, is the evidence generated in time? Is it timely? And then the hope is that that evidence that's been generated will in fact be used. And there are different types of use that we talk about. There can be, did the evidence say, do this, was this done? But also, did the evidence help in conceptual clarity and understanding how programs worked, or symbolically in raising the profile of particular interventions, etc.? And then we're hoping, as Edoé started us off with, that if this evidence is in fact used, it will lead to improved policy performance and impact. But how do we get there? It doesn't happen automatically. So the behavior change approach which we took was that the need for policymakers to use evidence, they need the motivation to use evidence, they need the capability to use evidence, and they need the opportunities to use evidence. And how does that happen? That happens through brokering awareness, agreement with the evidence, access to the evidence, interaction and trust of the evidence, the ability to use the evidence, and processes of institutionalizing or formalizing the use of evidence. And those, what we call change mechanisms, can be assisted by a range of what we call use interventions: capacity building, awareness raising, access, maybe platforms, repositories of evaluations, through encouraging champions, through organizational change processes, or indeed they could be things that happen outside the state, for example, protests or legal challenges. All of these are, in a sense, can be use interventions to try and encourage the use of evidence. And hopefully, if that happens, then there will be that awareness, agreement, access will happen. There will be the motivation, capability, and opportunity, and that evidence will be used. This is not a linear process. It happens in an interactive way. But evidence use doesn't take place in a vacuum. The context is critical. So it's the two boxes that I started off with. And some of the factors are the significance of the policy challenge or question. For example, commitments made to international regional agreements, the level of financial investment, whether there's a legal requirement that some review happens and so evidence is needed. There can be catalysts of change. There can be crises. There can be pressure from development partners. There can be pressure from civil society. And then there's the broader political and socio-cultural environment. So, for example, the timing of elections is absolutely critical. Policymakers are willing often to take risks a year into their term, but they're not willing to take risks a year before an election. Another factor is whether decision makers are actually captured by vested interests. And we're seeing now, for example, how the fossil fuel companies have captured many politicians in many countries to try and obstruct movement around climate change and just transition. What space is there for public participation and civil society engagement? What level of interest and engagement of stakeholders? And then there's the institutional environment, the systems, the champions, the type of leadership, the culture, etc. All of these affect how evidence is used. And in fact, one of the core messages from the book is that people who are what you might call the evidence champions, the evidence entrepreneurs, whether it's evaluation officers or M&E officers or research officers, they need to be able to play this context to decide on the right use interventions that are needed to try and help evidence be used. And just to give you a few highlights, what have we learned about promoting the use of evidence? So as I mentioned, context matters. Make sure you understand it. And I love this quote from Carol Weiss: evaluation is a rational enterprise that takes place in a political context. And the evidence use is complex. It begins long before you start generating evidence, and it needs to be planned for and woven into the whole process. You need obviously to make sure there's demand. You need to make sure there's credibility, quality, and legitimacy in the evidence journey. And you need to remember that evidence use isn't just about whether a recommendation was taken and it was adopted, but there are conceptual uses, there are symbolic uses, there are processes uses which are important as well. And we must not be naive. There are active processes happening in most governments to obstruct the use of evidence. And the classic example I mentioned is around climate change. We've known for 50 years climate change has happened. The need to cut fossil fuels was only included in the wording of a COP. At this COP, 28 COPs later. So you can see the forces that have been there to obstruct the use of evidence. And some of the other lessons: passive provision of evidence does not work. The process needs active facilitation and knowledge brokering. You need to establish formal structures to manage the evidence processes and maintain ownership. You need to build the capacity of managers, decision makers, and stakeholders. And the stakeholders, one of the areas that I'm very interested in working now is about how those stakeholders need to be civil society and communities, and not just top-down stakeholders. And then you need to find ways to package and communicate the evidence simply and effectively, ensuring you're presenting it, that the evidence is relevant to policy concern, going beyond describing the problem to providing practical and realistic solutions, the recommendations being as specific as possible, bringing in values into the process. It's very important. Again, coming back to the climate issue, the issue of values is absolutely fundamental, and the evidence generation process is not a completely neutral process that's distinct from values. So the way evaluation is done, the topics that are chosen are very value linked, and then making sure that formats of reports are readable and accessible. If you have an evidence system, it makes some of the elements automatic. And Edoé mentioned that he's working with 4 countries in West Africa who are developing evaluation systems. That really helps. The book shows quite a lot how those having that sort of national evaluation system really helps in making evidence used. So I provided the links. As I mentioned, it's open access. You can access it free. And also on the Clear Anglophone Africa website, there are policy briefs, there are videos in English and in French on each of the cases, on the lessons that emerge. So please do go there and use it. They're very useful for training as well as for your own learning in your own case. So thanks very much. I also want to acknowledge Minette Habari, who is the co-PDI on this research, who's from Kenya, and was critical to this work that I've just gone through. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian, for this brilliant intervention. The message is very important for us because Ian's message is to tell us that, in fact, moving from evidence to practical action, there is an awareness and a proactive approach that has to be set up in order for evidence to become a subject, a baseline for decision making. And this approach can take several forms. We have to be aware of this fact, and evidence can take different forms. We have to be aware of this, and that is why we must become aware of the fact that we must not be naive when we talk about using evidence in decision making, because in the process of developing national systems, such as what we are doing currently, we have to be careful not to create disillusionment, because in a context where countries are poor, using public resources for evaluation as part of the agenda of evaluations conducted by the countries, this represents costs for our countries, and we must ensure that this resource is truly useful, which means that the evaluations are truly used for decision making. So thank you, Ian, for specifying this, and we will now pursue our discussion, as I mentioned earlier, by listening to Professor Dia, who will tell us, based on his research in decision science, what lessons we can take away today as factors that foster decision-making based on evidence. Professor Dia, the floor is yours. Thank you, Dimitri. Hello to everyone. Thank you for your presence. As far as my presentation is concerned, I was asked to answer the question regarding research in decision science on the issue of rationality in the process of decision-making in public policies. So it is important, first of all, before answering, it is important to note that my topic is in management science. So my approach is going to be based on that discipline. I would like to share with you a little bit of the research that I have done in the past few days to answer this question. And I will, for this purpose, rely on the points that you have at the bottom of this slide. It is first and foremost important to take note, no matter what discipline one is looking at, whether we're talking about social sciences, political sciences, management science, etc. The problem of making a decision can be either an opportunity that presents itself or an issue, a problem that emerges from the environment in the organization or in society. In the area of public policies, this opportunity or issue can, for instance, be the need to improve well-being in the population, either in the area of healthcare or in the area of education or other. In the society, there, Ian Goldman mentioned several examples. In his work. So please, the next slide. So in order to make good decisions, given the complexity of the issues and what is at stake, it is important to have a process for decision making that is rigorous, that factors in all the elements that are relevant to making that decision. For that purpose, there are some effective practices. It is that will contribute to making a good decision. So we recommend a process in several steps. You have here 7 steps that are listed. The first step, looking at, first of all, is we're talking about a clearly defined problem or opportunity. You have to define the criteria for making the decision. Very often this is forgotten, but it is a crucial step in order to make a decision. And very often the criteria, there are many criteria. And in that situation, usually decisions are based on 1 or 2 criteria, but most of the problems have many criteria. And this is a crucial step. It has to be covered before evaluating the different options that are the different alternatives that could be considered. So after having done that, you have to move to looking at the alternatives.
And for this, it is important to identify as many alternatives as possible in order to make sure you are taking the right decision. Then you evaluate the alternatives based on the decision-making criteria that you chose. So some of the criteria can be quantitative, qualitative, objective, subjective. If you use these criteria to evaluate the alternatives, then you will continue with the evaluation. And you need to examine the different criteria that you are using. After that, you will evaluate the potential risk associated with each alternative. This is also very important. If you are evaluating the alternative and you're trying to choose just one, it is very important to take into account the potential risks that could come with that decision. What the risks associated with the implementation of each alternative. This is also based on the third step. And looking at the potential risks. With both of these, we will be ready to make a good decision. So then you will move to step 5, make a decision, and then implement it. So once you have evaluated alternatives and considered the risks, you will then move into the action part of the process. Once you have made the decision, that's not the end, though. You also need to monitor the results. So you will be overseeing the results and the consequences of the implementation. You can also identify problems that arose from the decision that was made and make necessary adjustments. Finally, another very important step is to learn from the decision that was made and to look at the process of the decision-making process and identify areas of improvement. So this is a very important process. No matter what sector you're working in, it is very important to make sure that you have a very rigorous decision-making process. Next slide. So now I talked about step number 5, which is the point at which you make a decision. And now it is important to recognize that the time that a decision is taken, there are many potential influences on the decision maker. These can be internal influences, or they can be external. So these influences can have a significant effect on decision-making capabilities. So we can categorize them into a few different groups. First, we have the cognitive bias. These are inherent tendencies or inherent trends in the decision maker's thought processes. So these biases can have an effect on the judgment and the capacity for rational decision making. Another influence, emotions. Emotions can have an effect on the perception of risk. Someone who is very happy or very joyful might take more risks. And these risks could have a significant effect on the organization. Or someone who is dealing with personal issues at the time of decision making might be more risk averse, and so will not take a more risky or audacious decision. So it is important to think rationally about this. There are also cultural and societal influences. We know that education, cultural history, and social norms can have an influence on values and beliefs of individuals. This, in turn, can have an effect on the decision-making process. For example, in certain cultures, selective decision-making is considered of higher value than individual decision-making, while in other societies, it's the opposite. Finally, we have organizational pressures. This can include, for example, within the organizational or within the public sector, in a ministry, for example, there can be different influences. There can, for example, be limited time. The decision maker will have to make a decision very quickly without having time to consider all of the different alternatives and all of the relevant data. There can also be financial constraints. Everything could be based on a very strict budget, for example. The time that is required to take a decision may require the more expenditure, which can be limited to financial constraints. So it is important to take into account all of these different influences. Finally, another organizational pressure is groupthink. So that is prioritizing group consensus rather than individual decision making. So you have 1 minute left. That is perfect. Yes, I will move forward quite rapidly. So when we're talking about groupthink, this is a situation in which the decision maker can be influenced by the functional activities of the group. and might consider the group consensus rather than individual decision-making process. Next slide. Let's talk about rationality and irrationality. We're going to go over this quite quickly because I covered a little bit of this earlier. We need to take into account the decision-making process and the different influences on a decision maker. In scientific literature, rationality and irrationality are contradictory concepts. By definition, rationality is the ability to think logically, to take logical decisions that are based on evidence and reason, and to act in such a way as to maximize personal interest or public interest. But irrationality are behaviors and beliefs that defy logic, that are not based on evidence, and that often lead to undesirable results. Now, we can mitigate the effects of this if we recognize it, if we adopt or make sure that we use critical thinking skills when making decisions. And this way, we can ensure that we are making logical decisions. Next slide, please. Despite all of this, the reality is that it is essentially impossible to completely remove irrationality from a decision-making process. Research suggests that the key to effective decision-making is looking for balance between rationality and irrationality. And public policy is no exception to this. Thank you very much. I hope that I have not gone too far over my time, but I wanted to make sure as well that we covered all of the essential points. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mohamed. This is a very clear message. We're looking at how do we improve our ability to make logical decisions. We have a well thought out process, and we've looked at the role of irrationality and the effect that it can have. And now we will hear from the Minister Antonin Dossou, who's going to talk about his experiences and reflections based on those experiences. Thank you so much. It is truly a pleasure to participate in this webinar. It's been a few years, probably about 15 years, since I have been involved in public policy decision-making. Most of it was done in Benin. And I'd like to talk about some of my reflections based on these experiences. And finally, it is important to talk about the difficulty in rational decision-making and how we can make sure that we're using evidence in public policy decision-making. And I think that this is a very important question that we are raising. And I'd like to answer in saying that based on my experience, in reality, there was often a lack of a statistical system that would enable us to systematically have access to this evidence. So because we did not have this statistical system, but also there was not an organized program that was planned in advance, there was no planning process for the evaluations that we were to carry out. And so this meant that we did not have all of the systems in place that would have improved our decision-making processes. The nature of public decision-making is something that Mohamed just spoke about. in my experience, when it's time to make a decision, you want to move from one situation to the next. You are seeking to resolve a problem, or you are moving towards a goal. And at that time, decisions need to be made. When we're looking at the public policy, the decision-making process is one by which the policymaker will take action in order to allow us to move from situation A to situation B. To do this, he needs to be able to analyze the situation. He needs to have access to all necessary information. And that is why a statistical system and an evaluation program are necessary. This is where they come in. A decision maker needs to be able to collect the necessary information and evaluate the different options. Then you'll be able to make the decision that will, in his or her opinion, maximize benefit for society. There is an essential analysis step in there. Once this analysis has been performed, you're able to make a decision. And then once you have made that decision, you need to be able to implement it. So a policymaker needs access to all information that will allow him to objectively analyze the situation and identify the different paths that will allow society to move from situation A to situation B. This is all part of rational and logical decision making. But it is important that the evidence comes from a specific analytical process. So that is why it is important to have a system. The analysis and evaluation are also essential.
But in reality, public decision makers are human beings with their emotions, with their objectives, and their interests. And so their rationality is influenced fundamentally by several factors other than availability. The availability of and the quality of evidence. And in this regard, I will connect with the and agree with the summary that Ian presented, because outside of this purely technical aspect, you have to really take into account other considerations. And the first one I wish to mention is the quality of leadership. I will do James Friedman Cocca, and I spoke about this in my book, The Challenge of in Sub-Saharan Africa. Like Cocca, I will draw a difference between the statesman and the politician. Here's the quote, page 174 in my book. The difference between the politician and the statesman is that the politician is thinking of the next elections, whereas the statesman is thinking of the future generations. So over and above your rational analysis, if you are more driven by political interests, you will not make the decision that the data should normally, that the evidence should normally lead you to make. And here I would like to stress this: for the statesman, things are not obvious, because if you have responsibilities, if you are exercising responsibilities, you will be subjected to this. You will find yourself running up against these problems. An example: I decide to build a school. I have to make the decision to build it in village A or B. When I choose A or B, I am doing politics. So to choose A, I have certain criteria, specific criteria. But if I have personal calculations that dominate at that moment, then I would not necessarily choose A, I would choose B. So again, on page 174 in my book, I mention the main qualities of a statesman or a stateswoman. 1, do not get rich through this position. 2, assimilate facts quickly. A statesman has to make decisions and have a clear idea of what is at stake and of the pluses and minuses of any choice that needs to be made. Otherwise, he is not a statesman. 3, adapt to circumstances. A statesman must be able to make decisions that are not dogmatic, but that are adapted to the situation at hand. 4, monitoring the situation. If the statesman is subject to anger, he will never be able to make the right decision. He has to take the high road, be inspired, and to make sure that he's making the right decision. And 5, dig your own grave. In other words, when you have to make a decision that is good for the community, but that could lead you to end your own political career or leave the position that you are in. If you are a statesman, you will nevertheless, despite all of it, make that decision, because the statesman should take the back road with respect to the community. I think that this is an important bias in making decisions that are rational based on evidence. And now, the pressure groups in terms of making policies, when you decide, for instance, to make a reform, implement a reform, whatever that reform may be, you are shifting the focus of group A toward group B, from group A to group B. So group A will fight in order to prevent you from moving, and group B will fight to get you to shift. This was pretty well described by Ian. And in chapter 9, there's a person who performed a reform in Benin, and I was already involved in the situation. I can tell you that this was quite an amazing episode, and I'm ready to talk about it later on if there are any questions. And the last point is corruption. Corruption can create an obstacle to collecting evidence. Any position of responsibility is often considered to be a source for personal wealth building, enrichment. So I will be ending here by saying simply that systematizing the production of evidence and monitoring this, systematizing the production of data that is available, as well as systematically planning evaluations of public policies, will make it possible to expand the use of evidence in decision making. This is important. I would say that using evidence is not an option. We have no choice. It is an obligation. It makes it easier to make rational decisions and thereby contributes to citizens' well-being. Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Mr. Dossou. Pursuant to after Jan, who reminded us that making decisions based on evidence is not an automatic thing. Many other factors are involved. The context, the catalysts you need to find. It's necessary to have an approach that is aware before even the evaluation, before you can improve things through evidence. And Professor, so we were reminded that we need to have a rigorous approach, and there's always a connection between rationality and irrationality in this process. And as you said, Mr. Dossou, in fine, the individual, the decision maker, is the person who the quality of that decision maker comes into play, and this is what can improve decision making, which implies creating a critical mass of evidence in order to facilitate the process of decision making. Thank you for your presentations. We will conclude this session of the interventions of the panelists with our next speaker, Mr. Gonzalo, who, based on his experience in developing national evaluation systems and as an evaluator, will tell us what he thinks and the lessons he has learned in this process for making decisions based on evidence. And you will have room to ask your questions. You can use the chat for that. And we will come back later on to the issue of, in the question and answer session, we will come back to these aspects. So stay with us. We will listen to Mr. Gonzalo Hernández Licona.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, bonjour. And it's really a pleasure being here. And it's really a pleasure exchanging these ideas with all of you. And it's really a pleasure to have a webinar with this title, right? Rationality, reality, this uneasy match between decision-making and evidence. If I was reading this title like 15 or 20 years ago, I would say, no, that's not right, because I came from academia. So I was very rational in my way. And I would say, no, whenever we produce a very good piece of evidence, a very solid evaluation with all the rigorous and technical issues, then when we take this one to the government, they are going to use it immediately, because that's a rationality. I mean, we are providing them with an excellent piece of information, and for them, it's going to be very useful, and therefore they're going to use it in their decision-making process right away. So I was that naive 20, 15 years ago, coming from academia. And then you start realizing that is not exactly what is happening. I mean, the marriage is not that solid between decision-making and evidence in government. And I would say, the more you think about what is happening in government, because then I moved from academia to government. So I was able to see what happens there as well. So as we said in Mexico, I was at one moment a person asking for a drink in a bar, and then I was the bartender on the other side of the table. And then when you are there, you can understand the realities of both worlds, and therefore you can understand better what is the rationality on both sides. So let me start by asking you, what is happening in our cases? Let's forget about the government for a second. What is the process that we have when we use information to select our daily decision-making process? I mean, do we go to the grocery store, we go to the supermarket, we go to buy stuff? What is the way in which we use information to make the better decision? What type of information do we have? And in fact, what happens is that we have a lot of information. Some information came from the past, some information came from that moment. We can read or not the labels of the food. How do we select our groceries? How do we select our lunches? Should we go always for the healthy stuff? Or we should also go for the nice ice cream or the nice sandwich, which is not very healthy, but we have an information saying, hey, that ice cream, we used to take it, and it was very nice. And that piece of information is very useful. And therefore, we end up buying a nice ice cream or a nice sandwich or a nice French fries. Even all the evidence may tell me that is not perhaps the best option. So what happens is, how do we use information to select what we have selected? Careers, groceries, partners. What type of information do we have when we select a partner? Because we have a feeling, but do we also listen to other people? Did we listen to our mother about this partner, or it was just the feeling? How we balance our information? And what is true is that, I mean, at least for me, is that I don't use always the most scientific piece of information for my decision-making process in my daily decisions about budget, how I spend the budget. And the fact is that we are always making decisions with information we have. We always have information, and we make decisions with limited time and resources. I mean, to find a partner, perhaps the partner ideally for me is somewhere in, I don't know, South Africa. But it's very costly for me to find that person. Therefore, I find the person who's around me with the limited information that I have. And very importantly, whenever we make decisions, we have many objectives in mind, and these are changing. So going back to the lunch today, when we have food, we have in mind sometimes the healthy part. We want to be healthier, but also we want to have pleasure in food. Therefore, we have competing objectives when we select things. So that happens to us all the time. We use information. Sometimes it's very good information, very good evidence. Sometimes it's not that good, but it's information that we have. We have feelings, we have emotions. As Mohamed said, we have beliefs, we have scientific stuff, we have Google, Twitter, Instagram, grandmothers, mothers, friends, and we have all this information. So when we go to governments, this happens, but even more difficult, because there are much more pressures in terms of government decision-making process, and their objectives as well. It's a huge objective. I mean, there are so many objectives. So it is not true that policymakers only think about improving people's lives. I mean, some of us do, but as well, they think about getting reelected, they think about promotions, they think about power, we think about money, and therefore, it is not completely true, as I thought 20 years ago, that the only objective that any person in government has is to improve people's lives. And therefore, they were going to use the very precious evaluation we produce for that. As Mr. Dossou said, yes, we do have, ideally, it would be great to have state men all the time making decisions. But we have a lot of politicians as well. And in my view, the majority are politicians, and therefore we have to work with that decision-making process, right? People in government, they don't like bad news. In fact, they always want to show good results. Therefore, if you're telling me this evaluation is showing that this program is not working, I'm not going to use it straightforward. I may reject that as well. Therefore, and as people said before, we need to deliver today. Sometimes I cannot wait for you to give me an impact evaluation in 2 years' time. Let's make decisions with what we have. And therefore, on the evaluation side, we need to understand that process so we can offer the best information, the most rigorous information with several characteristics. Sometimes we are not able to produce a very long impact evaluation, but we can have another type of evaluations in which we can provide good information for policymakers. So let me finish with this slide about some elements that I think are important. Some of them have been said before. Of course, politicians and people need good evidence available in the country. Therefore, investing in public goods such an M&E system is very important. It doesn't mean that they're going to use it today, but if we invest on that, is going to be used for many politicians, for many state people in the future. And they will have available evidence almost all the time. So we don't have to start from scratch. So investing in M&E system is a public good. And as a country, we need to invest in that. We need to focus on learning, right? Because, I mean, of course, evaluation is about accountability. But learning is perhaps a better way of entering government. We have to learn because it is not easy to produce public policy. Therefore, we all are learning here and we all are committing mistakes. Therefore, the learning process is important. Ideally, we should have an M&E which is independent and therefore credible, not only for government, but for the whole society. So that element of that M&E is important. Evidence should be close to policymakers. If I give a person an impact evaluation with 3 pages long and plenty of equations, that is not an easy way to have a decision-making process in which that person is going to take into account that piece of information. Let's make it easier. Sometimes in my dreams, it says, shall we have an app with good evidence in which in that country, the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Health, they should have a very concrete app with very concrete information about what we know about certain elements in health. And therefore, that information is close. Of course, easy to understand. Ian talks about the knowledge brokering process. Talking and communication with people, and Michael Quinn says, is part of making evaluations use. We have to translate our technical elements into the language of government. Otherwise, there is going to be a huge gap there. Of course, timely, it is important, and a very important element, in my view, is the incentives of that person you are giving the information. I mean, if you tell a policymaker, hey, this evaluation is going to improve people's lives, that's fine. But if you add, and this information is going to improve your future career to you, if we try to link the evidence with incentives, with individual incentives of policymakers and politicians, then it is easier for people to listen to that specific piece of information. And of course, I mean, when we make decisions ourselves, individual decisions, perhaps we don't have much pressure. I mean, if I make a mistake or if I do it irrationally, perhaps the problem is mine. But if governments made bad decisions based on either irrationalities or only on objectives regarding politics, then as a citizens, we have an issue. Therefore, ideally, of course, there should be public pressure asking politicians.
Gonzalo, could you please wrap up as
yes, like I'm about to finish. Thank you. So these elements, I believe, are important. There is rationality in general, although we need to understand other people's rationality, so we can have this bridge between what we know in terms of evidence and what the government would like to listen and to use in terms of decision making. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful.
So now we're going to talk about, or thank you for talking about the evaluation approach and also how we can work with policymakers, all while taking into account reality on the ground and the fact that policymakers are human beings. And so they have many different interests, and you need to look at both the community interests and the personal interests of the person who will be making these decisions. We have about 25 minutes left. We're talking about research and evaluation. And this is all related to what Jan is doing with different communities in Africa. And this might be a good way to look at how we can improve evidence evaluation in decision making.
Tell us what could be the potential of using the approach of the decolonization of evaluation to help improve the decision making in Africa.
So I think that the starting point, and this is where I particularly wear my International Evaluation Academy hat, is that the starting point is that where international policies and practice are leading us is to disaster. They're leading us into destroying the planet, and they're leading us to extreme inequality. That's happening internationally, and it's happening nationally in most of our countries, where much of the decision-making process is captured by elites. The top 10% are doing well, the rest are suffering. And so we're saying we need to have a different way of understanding how to create a healthy planet that where humanity plays a role as part of nature, not separate from nature, and where we lead to both a healthy ecosystem and a healthy society where people where inequality is much lower. Now, if you just use the mental frames that have been used, particularly in the last 50 years, we will carry on exploiting the planet and exploiting people, and we will lead to continuation of the same results. We need a different way of understanding where we think in a much more holistic way about humanity's role in creating a healthy society. And indigenous and traditional systems often operate in a much healthier way. So many of the systems, policymaking systems, have been captured by elites to benefit the elites. So we need to find ways to listen more to local people and their priorities, and make sure that the programs and policies are really supporting those and not supporting capture by elites. And similarly, when we're doing evaluations, we need evaluations which are not just perpetuating the status quo, but asking fundamental questions which challenge the way the world is going. Otherwise, we are complicit with the problem. We're not part of the solution. So we're exploring how to think about both evaluations, but also evaluation systems that are trying to resolve the problem and not complicit with capture by elites.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We know that those of you who are listening, you also have your own experiences and you have questions. So now let's hear from you. We are now going to move into the Q&A. So if you would like to speak, you can raise your hand. We'd be happy to hear from you. I'm also going to be looking in the chat to see if there are any questions. We have quite a few questions that have been asked in the Q&A function. Some have already been answered. And we will work to answer those that are in there now. But if you'd like to speak, please raise your hand. I see a hand from Mr. or Ms. Lamizana, Birgi Lamizana. I see that you've raised your hand. Can you hear us? Mr. Bacciono? Thank you. So we will take about 3 more questions, and so that way each panelist will be able to answer 1 question. So now, not Lamizana, Mr. Bationo. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for this webinar. I am the partnership manager for an organization that works in impact evaluations. My question is with regard to the decolonization of evaluations. I'd like to better understand this aspect. For a long time, the evaluation of public policy was carried out by certain groups, but I'd like to know what we're doing to decolonize this work. I would also like to know about the politicization of evaluation. When we're looking at the image of this in Africa. Thank you very much for these questions. Now, Mr. or Ms. Lua. Mr. Lua, please go ahead. Can you hear us? We don't hear you. It looks like you have the microphone, so you should be able to turn it on. Yes, hello? Yes. Thank you so much. I have 2 questions. The first question is, how do you deal with the limits related to time in decision making? One of the speakers talked about the difficulty of respecting time. Second question is related. When we're looking at reality, how do we account for the situation of rural communities? Many people who are illiterate, how do you account for them in decision making?
Excellent. Donc,
Excellent.
merci
Thank you
beaucoup
very
à
much
tous pour ces
everyone
questions.
for these
Alors,
questions.
oui, nous
So
avions des
we
questions
have
pour
questions
chaque
for each
panéliste.
panelist. The question
La question
regarding
sur
the
la
complexity,
complexité
geopolitical
géopolitique et
and
la prise de décision.
decision making.
Donc,
This
cette question
question
peut
can
être
be
abordée
approached, discussed
par
by Dia, Professor Dia.
Professeur Dia. La
The
question
question
sur la
decolonization.
qu'est-ce qu'on entend
What
par
do
la
we mean by
décolonisation
decolonization? That would be for
Yann.
Ian.
La
The
question de
issue
la
of
politisation de l'évaluation
politicizing
pour le ministre
evaluations
Antonin.
would be for Minister
Et
Antonin.
comment tenir
And
compte
how
du
do we
temps,
take into
du
account
défi
the
du
challenges of
temps
time
dans
in
les
evaluation?
évaluations pour
That would be
Gonzalo.
for Gonzalo.
Et
And the
la
situation
situation
of
des
rural
communautés rurales,
communities,
comment
how
prendre la voix des
to
communautés rurales dans
include
la
the
prise de
voice of rural
décision pour chacun d'entre
communities
vous, pour ceux qui
in
veulent
decision making.
commenter
That would be
sur
for each
cet
one of you to
élément.
comment
Donc, on va
upon
commencer avec
if
la
you wish.
première question
So let's begin
sur la
with
complexité
geopolitical
géopolitique.
complexity.
Donc,
Dia.
Dia.
Thank you.
Merci Edoé, merci
to
aussi
you. Thank you also to the
à la
person
personne
who
qui a
asked
posé
the
la
question.
question. En fait, dans
In
le
the
processus
process
de
of
prise de
decision
décision que
making
j'avais
that
présenté,
I
j'avais
presented, I
mentionné
had mentioned
les
the
pressions
organizational
organisationnelles. Donc,
decisions. This
ça
goes
va au-delà tout
beyond
simplement
the
de
organization
l'organisation en tant
as
qu'entreprise
a
ou quelque chose comme
company.
ça. Donc, ça peut aller
So
même au niveau
even at the
national et
national and
international.
international levels,
Il va toujours
there
y
must
avoir
always there
des
will always
influences sur les
be
prises de
influences
décision. Mais
on
le plus
decision
important,
making.
c'est
The most important is
d'avoir
to
un
have
processus
a
rigoureux d'analyse
rigorous analytical
dans lequel
process of analysis where the
les évaluations
evaluations
des
of the
alternatives sont basées sur
alternatives
des
are
critères
based on
précis, avec
specific,
des
very
critères bien
well-defined
définis,
criteria,
en utilisant
using
des données bien
specific
précises.
precise
en faisant
data,
une analyse
by
rigoureuse
conducting a rigorous analysis
arriver à
to
une
arrive at
décision.
a decision. Now,
Maintenant,
you
il faut
have
tenir
to
en
take
compte
into
les
account
facteurs.
other
Il y a des
factors,
facteurs
such as social
sociaux,
factors,
il y a des
political
facteurs politiques.
factors.
Il
They
faut les
must be
intégrer
included
dans le
in the
processus de décision
decision-making process in
pour
order
pouvoir y
to
arriver.
achieve this,
Donc,
to
pour
succeed.
la question de
So for
la
the
personne
who
qui avait
asked
posé
the
la
question,
question,
I
donc, j'imagine,
imagine,
je
I
comprends, bon,
understand,
c'est pas,
it
il n'est
isn't
pas
very
très clair quand elle parle de
it's not very
géopolitique, à
clear
quoi elle
what
fait
you're referring
allusion.
to when you talk about
Bon, si
geopolitical
nous, on est en
aspects.
train de
We are
parler
currently talking about
de
decision-making,
décision de décision dans
decisions
dans les
in
études politiques, comment
political
dirais-je,
contexts,
les politiques
public
publiques.
policy
Donc,
context,
que ça soit au niveau des
both for
localités ou au
local
niveau national. Donc,
communities
le plus
or
important
nationally.
dans ce
The most
contexte-là,
important thing in
c'est
that
de
context is
voir,
to see and
de
define
définir clairement
clearly
c'est quoi le
what the
besoin.
need is. What
Qu'est-ce qui est
is
le
the
besoin
need
de
in
la
terms
décision
of
qui doit
the
être
decision,
prise?
for the decision
C'est
that needs
quoi
to be
les objectifs principaux
made? What are the
de cette
precise
décision?
objectives
Et
for
donc,
that
si
decision?
cette
On that
base-là, si les
basis, if
critères
the
sont bien
criteria are well
définis,
defined,
si tous les
if
facteurs
all
sont
the
pris en
factors are taken
considération, on
into
devrait arriver
account,
à prendre une bonne décision. Et
then
puis, il ne faut pas avoir
it should
aussi
be
peur de
successful.
prendre
And
une
also, one
décision.
must
Donc,
not be
ça, c'est un
afraid
des
of making a
facteurs.
decision.
Je n'avais
That
pas
is
eu le temps
another
de bien
aspect
élaborer
which I didn't
là-dessus.
have time to
Donc,
expand
quand on
on.
prend une
When
décision, on
you
ne doit pas
make a
avoir peur de
decision,
prendre
one
la
must not
décision.
be afraid of
Je
making the
pense
decision.
qu'Antonin avait mentionné
I think
cela.
Antonin
Dans
had
certaines
mentioned
situations,
that
dans les
in
décisions
public
publiques,
decision-making,
on prend des décisions aussi
decisions
en creusant sa tombe.
must
Donc, dans
sometimes
certaines
be made
situations,
by
donc, il y a
digging
des
your
gens
own
qui ne vont pas être
grave.
contents. Donc, il
So
peut y
you can
avoir aussi
also
des impacts sur
have
la personne qui prend la
impacts
décision.
on the person
Je ne sais
who
pas
has
si j'ai
made the
bien
decision.
répondu
I'm
à la
not
question
sure.
de la dame,
I don't
mais
know whether I've answered the question that
c'est à ça que
the gentle lady
vraiment je
asked.
voulais simplement
The lady asked.
mentionner
But
quoi,
this
par
is what
rapport
I
à cette
wanted to
question.
mention with respect to
Oui.
this question.
Merci
Well,
beaucoup
thank you very much for this
la
answer.
réponse. En lien avec
In
ça, la
connection with this
complexité
aspect of the
des contextes, avec
complexity
les
of
crises,
the
avec tout ce qui
context,
se
the
passe
crises,
aujourd'hui,
everything
comment
that's
prendre des
happening now,
décisions
how to make a
dans
decision
ces
in that
contextes-là,
context,
en
knowing,
sachant, comme
as
ça a
was
été rappelé
recalled
par
by
notre
our
intervenant, que
speaker, that
tout est
everything is
politisé.
politicized.
Donc, la politisation même de
Politicization of
l'évaluation. Comment,
evaluation.
dans
In
ce
fact,
contexte-là, on arrive
how
quand
in
même
this
à prendre des
context is it
décisions.
possible to make
Ministre
decisions
Antonin, est-ce
nevertheless?
que vous voulez réagir par rapport à ça?
Minister, would you mind
Oui, tout à
reacting,
fait.
please?
Merci
Yes, thank you
pour
for
la
this
question
question,
qui
which
est
is essential for
essentielle
me.
pour moi. Alors,
I
je
would
répondrai en
answer in
deux
two
phases.
steps. First of
D'abord,
all, I would
je
say
dirais
it
c'est
is
normal
normal
qu'on
that
veuille
one
instrumentaliser
would
l'évaluation,
wish to
puisque
instrumentalize
beaucoup
evaluations.
ne
Many
savent
people
même
don't
pas ce
even
que
know
c'est.
what it is. Some
Certains
people
confondent
confuse evaluation
l'évaluation
with an
avec
audit.
l'audit,
Others
d'autres vont le
think that an
confondre
evaluation
avec
is an
l'inspection,
inspection,
le
a
contrôle.
verification, control.
D'autres vont
Others
penser qu'il
may
s'agit du
think
gendarme
that this is the
qui
policeman
vient
looking
dénicher un
for the
voleur.
thief.
Et
And
donc,
therefore,
avec
with
cette
this
mauvaise compréhension de
misunderstanding of what an
l'évaluation,
evaluation
oui,
is,
il est
it is
aisé
easy indeed
d'assister
to
à
see
des tentatives
attempts
de
to
politisation de l'évaluation.
politicize
Je
evaluation.
ne vous cache pas, je voudrais partager avec vous
have to be clear.
une
I
expérience personnelle
share a
vécue.
lived experience
J'étais
with
donc en
you.
charge de
So I was in charge
l'évaluation.
of an evaluation,
Et
and
puis,
in the
en
middle
plein
of
Conseil des
a
ministres, quelqu'un émet
minister's
l'idée qu'il faut
council
aller
meeting, somebody said that
évaluer
it is necessary to
la
evaluate
politique des
the
maires.
policies of the mayors.
Et on
And
ne me laisse pas
already,
déjà
I wasn't able to
définir
define
le
the
processus
evaluation
d'évaluation.
process.
Et on a envie de choisir,
And
pour moi, les
people had
maires
already
ou les
chosen the
mairies dans
mayors
lesquelles
or the
l'évaluation devrait
city
se faire.
halls where this evaluation was
Et quand je
supposed to
regarde
be carried out.
rapidement,
When I looked
je me
quickly,
rends compte
I
que ce sont
realized that these
des
are
mairies gérées
mayors
par
that are
l'opposition.
handled by the opposition.
Voilà.
And I
J'ai
learned
appris
something
quelque chose d'essentiel
essential
dans mon passage au gouvernement,
when I worked in the government
c'est
is
comment
how to
dire
say
non
no
sans
without
froisser.
offending.
Et
So I
donc,
can assure
je peux vous
you
assurer que
that
cette
that
évaluation
evaluation
n'a
was
pas été
not
faite,
performed
puisque
because it was
il était
clear
clair
that
qu'elle
its
voulait
aim
être
was to
instrumentalisée
be
pour
instrumentalized
affaiblir
to
les ténors de
weaken
l'opposition
the
dans le
leaders
cadre
of
de
the
la
opposition in
gestion
terms
des
of
villes
how they
qui leur
were
avaient
managing
été
cities
confiées.
that had been entrusted to them.
Alors,
So
comment faire
how
pour
to avoid
l'éviter?
this?
J'en
I
ai parlé
mentioned
tout
this
à
earlier
l'heure,
on
rapidement.
briefly. For
Pour
me,
moi, c'est la
it's
systématisation.
systematization
Il faut
You have to be
pouvoir, dès le
capable
début,
from the very start.
systématiser
You
un
have to be
programme
able to
d'évaluation
systematize an evaluation
avec des termes de référence
program
bien définis
with
au départ,
terms of reference that are
avec
clearly defined from the
vraiment les
outset,
questions d'évaluation
with
bien
questions for
précises,
the evaluation
ce qui
process that
fait
are very
que cela ne
clear, so
laisse
that
pas
there is
place
no
éventuellement
room
à
for any potential desire to
de politisation
politicize
qui sera,
which
qui
for
pour moi
me
est
is
inéluctable.
unavoidable. That's
C'est
the
comme
way
ça.
things are.
Et c'est comme cela.
And I would like to
J'en
seize
profite
this
peut-être pour répondre à
opportunity
la question
to answer the question of
Ibrahim
Ibrahim
Saïd
Said in
dans
the
le
chat,
chat, qui
who
dit
says,
qu'est-ce
what
qui
can
peut aider
help
à avoir
to
des décisions
have
des hommes d'État?
decisions by
Est-ce
statesmen?
qu'avoir des institutions
Would
qui
that be
protègent
institutions
les hommes
that can
d'État peut
protect
faciliter
where
la prise en compte de décisions
so that the
rationnelles?
statesmen can make rational decisions?
Les
The
institutions ne suffisent
institutions
pas.
are not enough.
Il faut déjà que,
On a
à titre
personal
personnel,
level, it is
la
necessary for
personne
the person
concernée soit un homme d'État
in question to
et
be
non
a
un
statesman rather
politicien.
than a politician.
Si vous
You
êtes
are a
un
politician,
politicien,
you
vous
are
êtes dans les calculs,
calculating. You
vous
want to
voulez défendre,
defend, I would
je dirais,
say,
des intérêts
personal interests,
personnels de votre clan, de votre parcours, ou
defend your
consort,
party,
toute institution en place vraiment
and
ne
there's
servira à rien.
no
En
institution will help in
revanche,
that
moi je
case.
suis,
On the other hand,
je promeus la
I
transparence. Et en
defend
fait, c'est ça.
transparency,
C'est la lumière
light
braquée sur les
focused
agissements des
on
uns et des
people's
autres
actions.
qui permet de faire
This
reculer
light is what makes it
la frontière
possible
des
to
ténèbres et
push
qui
back the
contraint quelque
darkness
part
and
à bien faire,
contribute
sachant
to
que dans
knowing that
cette
in this
dynamique de
dynamic,
redevabilité, on vous voit
we
faire
see what you are
et vous avez
doing
intérêt
and
à
you
bien faire.
better do the right thing.
Merci
Thank you
Didier.
very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo.
For you,
There was a question for you regarding the timing of
et comment
evaluations
faire
and
entendre
what
la
you
voix de la
do
population.
with respect to the population.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, as we said before, which is obvious, policymakers and the government, they make decisions almost every day, and therefore they need good information almost every day. And therefore, sometimes it's very difficult to wait 2 years or 3 years or 1 year, or sometimes 2 months or 3 months to get information. Therefore, there are various possibilities here, but sometimes I find that the evaluation units that we have in many countries, the evaluation units, what they do is they evaluate the programs of government and then they take some time out of it. But I believe that there's always missing an analysis unit within the evaluation unit, which means not only people doing evaluations on programs, but people getting information that is out there anyway. We have so much information around in almost all topics, and therefore we need always an evaluation unit making available very good evidence to policymakers almost as we speak. Therefore, it is very important not only to evaluate what is happening in government, but being able to get information in a very easy way, right? Again, when you handle to a policymaker or a politician a 3 pages evaluation with equations, that is not going to be, nothing happens there, right? And secondly, Edoé, I believe that we as an evaluators, we need to have several evaluation tools. Some are rapid evaluations. We can assemble information very easily, so we can offer what we have. Otherwise, if we are not timely, politicians are going to take the information that is already there, and sometimes that is not a good, sometimes it's not strong evidence.
Yeah, thank you. And now for Jan, on if you can clarify what do you mean by decolonization?
So, okay, so it means so we are looking to try and think from first principles how evaluation can contribute to new thinking, and so that means not being bound by the international models which dominate thinking, not being bound necessarily particularly by Western international models, particularly those that have a particular version of neoliberal capitalism, which is very growth orientated and very exploitative of people and exploitative of the planet. So how can we rethink the models? So one of the key ways, and an example here would be, who is interested in having a type of agricultural system which is dominated by large commercial farmers, where the money may go to the state, but it's relatively few people accumulating quite a lot of wealth, as opposed to small-scale farmers operating much more sustainable farming practices, which are much more resilient to the emerging climate issues and which have benefits for far more people. Now, this relates to the point about the rural issue of taking rural people's views into account. If you don't involve the people who are affected and the users very directly, both in the program design, in program implementation, and in monitoring and evaluation, you will end up with programs designed for elites by elites. So one of the key things is we need to change the power structures to try and listen much more to what ordinary people need and not what elites need. And that includes in the evaluation process, making communities, making civil society much more powerful in the evaluation process and with much more control over what happens with that evaluation.
Great, great. Très bien dit. Il y a un dernier intervenant dans le chat. Je demande votre générosité pour le prendre pour quelques minutes. C'est M. Yann Wopoud. Monsieur Yann, vous nous entendez?
Yes.
Yann Wopoud. Yann Wopoud. Yann Wopoud? No, I can see your... Monsieur Victor Borges.
Okay, is this okay now?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Thanks for the great presentations. I just think it's worth reminding us all, given what we've heard, which is great, that we really need to make much more effort, as we've already said, to analyzing the policy process, analyzing the policy environment. It's always changing, it's full of unknowns, and it's full of contradictory and conflicting opinions, and not opinions, but evidence and so on. And we're not always able to adjust to that. We don't put ourselves sufficiently in position of people who are taking decisions. And therefore, I think that the emphasis, which I see more and more on co-creation in the sense of collaborative work between decision makers and evaluators at every stage of the process. So in the end, we have a better chance of getting some agreement on what is feasible and what is not. And I think the other thing we have to bear in mind is the element of risk. One thing we have to try to understand is that all change, all policy innovation is going to have elements of risk, and the level of tolerance of risk of decision makers is really rather important. So I think there are these elements that we need to better understand to really work more effectively in what is essentially a very messy, a very contradictory situation where people's instincts and alliances and affinities may not always be things to be totally discounted. They may be a necessary part of the lubrication of decision making, which we'll be using of evidence. So general thing, well, let's improve our analysis, let's get more instruments, let's share more examples of good practice as our presenters have. Congratulations, thank you.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Yann. Mr. Victor
Thank
Borges,
you
pour
very much,
terminer,
Mr. Victor Borges, the last speaker before the conclusion. Can you hear me?
Oui.
Ça va?
Oui, ça va.
OK. Moi, j'ai une question générale. On est tous d'accord. Non, d'abord, je remercie les participants qui ont fait leur présentation. Je pense que les présentations sont très instructives. La question que je retire de toutes ces présentations, c'est la suivante. Comment créer, comment forger des politiciens avec une culture politique et de développement qui intègre harmonieusement les questions d'évaluation, de gestion des processus de prise de décision. Quand on regarde les partis politiques d'où sortent les gouvernants, on voit que la formation ne fait pas vraiment partie de leur stratégie. Donc, il n'y aura pas de bons décideurs de génération spontanée. Quand on parle de tout ça, de décideurs, il faut quelque part qu'on réfléchisse aussi sur comment former, éduquer éventuellement les décideurs. Et cette question-là, personne ne l'aborde. Voilà ma question. Merci pour l'attention.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Borges. Et nous sommes pratiquement à la fin. Nous allons accorder juste un petit tour de 1 minute pour chaque panéliste pour conclure et en essayant de répondre, bien sûr, à la question de Monsieur Borges, et ça nous servira de conclusion pour cette session. Donc, on va commencer avec Yann, comme on a commencé. 1 minute, conclusion.
So, I mean, I think we mustn't be naive about evidence. Evidence relates to power. We have to be looking at who has the power to control the evidence, who has the power to use the evidence, and whose voices are heard in generating the evidence.
Merci beaucoup. Gonzalo?
No, I mean, as evaluators, we need to keep looking ways of communicating better our stuff. I mean, of course, we would like to change what happens in government, but from the evaluator point of view, we cannot do that very easily. We have to communicate better. We have to be clear about what are the objectives sometimes of government. So we'll be able to have the skills to communicate better what we want. And another naivety is thinking that our stuff is going to be used. It's been a great webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ministre Dossou? Monsieur le ministre?
Yes, I think that we must create systems. We must make sure that we are systematically using statistics and data, and then that will influence our decision making. I think that we need to organize our statistical systems to make sure that we have reliable and readily available data. And that's one aspect. The other is to make sure that we have a systematic evaluation system to evaluate public policies. This is with regards to the organization. And with both of these pillars, then we will facilitate good decision making. To answer Mr. Borges' question, you have already said that. Nowadays, we have many more self-made men who are coming into power, who have gone through their own training, their own educational process. Personally, I have known, or I have experienced quite a few different trainings and seminars that taught me about evaluation and using data for decision making. We need to make sure that the elite and those who are in power are led to participate in these trainings. They need to be open to using data, and that is what is going to lead to more use of it in decision making. Thank you very much. Now, Patrizia, thank you so much. I would also like to add my voice to what Antonin has just said. I think it is important to systematize the use of statistics. We can do this through organizing seminars. We can organize working groups. But we need to make sure that decision makers understand the importance of using evidence in decision making. I would also like to support the idea of creating a national statistics group. For example, we can look at Canada. Canada has one of the most advanced public statistical organizations in the world. So all data is available through Statistics Canada. And I think that this is something that would support our work in African countries if we were able to create these systems that are independent of politicians, but that are in charge of all statistics and data. In this way, we could very quickly and very easily have access to and use data for decision-making processes. Thank you very much. And now I would like to hand the floor back to Patrizia for concluding remarks.
It was a pleasure for me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Edoé, and to all our distinguished panelists and speakers. It's been extremely interesting, and this is very much in line with the whole thinking that the Global Evaluation Initiative is taking forward in about providing capacities, training, disseminating knowledge. And these seminars is our little contribution today to this discussion. So for everybody that has participated, thank you very much. It has been a great pleasure to host you today. We will be posting the recording, the presentation, and the transcripts of the session on our knowledge platform, betterevaluation.org. I shared earlier the link in the chat, but since you have registered, you will also, in your inbox, you will find this information very soon. So thanks again. We look forward to having you again back at our next seminar that will take place sometime in February. You will hear from us. And with that, thank you, and I'll close.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Merci.
Bye-bye.
Au revoir.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.